When was the last time that you had an actual encounter with God? I bet it was probably more recent than you think. We encounter God every day in many, many ways. The problem is that most of us are not always aware of it. If we think that an encounter with God has to be something dramatic or ecstatic or otherworldly, like what happened to Isaiah in the first reading today, then most of our encounters with God wouldn't qualify. Although I have had some wonderful and deep moments of prayer in my life, none of them quite match Isaiah's encounter and his vision of God sitting on his throne in heaven with his garments filling the temple and angels surrounding him singing, "Holy, holy, holy." Most of our encounters are much more tame than that. A deep feeling of God's presence at the sight of the immensity of the ocean, or a sunrise or a sunset, or at the birth of a child, or even listening to a beautiful piece of music. Or it might be an encounter with the divine in the love that we feel for our spouse or a dear friend. It might be in the satisfaction we feel in our work or ministry to the sick or to the poor. In today's gospel, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John encountered the divine on the seashore, in a boat, doing the most ordinary of tasks, fishing. They had done this thousands of times before, and yet this time it becomes a divine encounter. And just because we don't feel God's presence in some dramatic or emotional way doesn't mean that it hasn't occurred. For example, we believe that every time we celebrate the Mass, we encounter God in word and sacrament. It is a real encounter, face to face, with God, but often we fail to be overwhelmed by it. Feelings are not the best judge of an encounter with God. There are 3 encounters with God in our scriptures for today: Simon Peter, Isaiah, and Paul. And in all of them, the first reaction was a feeling of fear. Fear of being in the presence of God because of sinfulness or smallness or creatureliness. Who am I that God would come to me? I'm a sinner. Isaiah, woe to me, I'm doomed, for I am a man of unclean lips, living among people of unclean lips. Peter, depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. Paul, I'm the least of the apostles, not fit to be called an apostle. This is classic. The beginning of the spiritual life is always a recognition or a consciousness of how great God is and how small I am, of how perfect God is and how sinful I am. Our first reaction to an encounter with God may be the desire to run away or to hide. This is normal. In the Ignatian spiritual exercises, the first step or stage is to experience this dynamic. This then will lead us into the recognition and the awareness of just how much God loves us and wants to save us and desires an intimate personal relationship with us. An encounter with God leads to great things. Bishop Barron calls our encounter with the divine an invasion of grace. He says that when Jesus got into Peter's boat, he invaded that boat with grace. When we encounter grace, we are given an opportunity to be transformed, to grow, and to cooperate with God's grace in doing amazing things. When we have an encounter with God, God inevitably calls us. Isaiah was called to be a prophet. Simon Peter was called to be the rock upon which Christ built the church. All the apostles were called to be fishers of men and women. Paul was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. There is an expression, God does not call the qualified. God qualifies the called. None of us is perfect. All of us are sinners. But God calls us, and then he qualifies us, and he gives us his grace. God will not call us to something without equipping us for the task. In an early interview with an Italian journalist, Pope Francis was asked, "Who is Jorge Bergoglio? Tell us something about you." And his response was, "I can say this above everything. I can honestly say that I am a sinner." We are all sinners, saved by Jesus Christ. This is the good news. The only question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do about that? Will we allow God to invade us with his grace, to qualify us and to call us? We might be afraid of what all that might mean. We may prefer to sit back comfortably in our lazy boy chairs. We may be terrified of taking a risk, not knowing exactly what saying yes to God might entail. Yes, we encounter the divine every day, usually in small and ordinary ways, sometimes in more dramatic and even surprising ways. But each encounter with God has the power to transform us and to draw us closer to Christ and to God. Each encounter carries within it the call to set out into the deep waters, to do more with our faith than we ever thought possible. Despite our sinfulness and despite our trepidations, God can and will do amazing things if we just let him. Jesus says to us today what he said to Simon Peter in the gospel: "Do not be afraid."